listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, in the wake of the Bondi Terror attack, the New South Wales Premier has announced a major overhaul of the state's firearms legislation. We unpack the latest proposed changes and speak with an expert on whether the overhaul will work to stop another mass shooting. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 18th of December. The Prime Minister has announced tougher hate speech laws targeting preachers who promote violence after the deadly terror attack on Sydney's Jewish community at Bondi Beach. Anthony Albanese outlined the new offences for aggravated hate speech and serious vilification, including higher penalties and expanded visa cancellation powers. The PM acknowledging the government could have acted sooner to combat antisemitism, saying more must now be done to confront what he calls, quote, an evil scourge.
Could we have done more? Of course, you could always do more. And, my heart goes out to what is a community that are suffering, that have been targeted. This is very different from Port Arthur or other atrocities, the murder of the police officers by so-called sovereign citizens in Queensland and Melbourne, because this was targeting based upon hate, based upon what is clear is based upon ISIS ideology.
The reforms also include education measures, online safety advice and a new task force to address anti-Semitism in schools and universities. Mr Albanese says he's open to recalling Parliament to pass the new laws pending bipartisan support. Meantime, an emotional funeral service has been held for 10-year-old Matilda today, the youngest victim of the Bondi Beach terror attack. Family and mourners remembering Matilda as sweet and kind, urging the community to keep her memory alive through their actions. Her coffin was adorned with bumblebee toys, with schoolmates remembering her as a ray of sunshine who brightened every day. In other news this Thursday, Optus has released a damning review into September's network outage that left hundreds of Australians unable to call 000 and was also linked to 2 deaths. The independent report found widespread failures during a routine network upgrade, with up to 75% of emergency calls failing during the 14-hour outage. It says Optus and contractor Nokia made multiple critical errors. Warnings from customers weren't escalated and internal systems clearly failed. The Optus board has accepted all recommendations, flagging possible financial penalties and staff terminations as the telco apologised and pledged to rebuild trust. Regulators and a Senate inquiry are continuing their investigations. And the son of Hollywood director Rob Reiner has appeared in court for the first time after being charged with the murder of both his parents. Nick Reiner, 32, did not enter a plea during the brief hearing in Los Angeles, with the case adjourned until early next year. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found stabbed to death in their home on the weekend. Prosecutors allege their son killed them before fleeing the scene. Reiner was arrested later that night and remains in custody. If convicted, he faces life in prison or potentially the death penalty, though prosecutors are yet to decide. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the planned overhaul of gun laws in New South Wales after the Bondi terror attack. The Premier, Chris Minns, announced that Parliament will be recalled next week to discuss the proposed changes that include a cap on the number of weapons a gun holder can own. We chat with Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute, who has conducted extensive research into gun laws, who says the changes are long overdue, warning our governments have become too complacent about the number of weapons in our community. Rod, thanks so much for joining us. We know right now that the New South Wales Premier has announced Parliament will resume next week with proposed overhauls of the current gun legislation. What are your initial thoughts on some of these proposed changes?
Yeah, initial thoughts are that this is a really good move. It's really important to remember straight off the bat, this has huge community support. In polling that the Australia Institute did a year ago, so before this week, before the Port Punker shootings, before the Croydon Park near miss, in polling a year ago, there was 75% community support for tougher gun laws. There's a majority across political persuasions. So the Premier is really kicking with the breeze here. The community really wants this. It's only a really small part of the gun enthusiasts but they're noisy. It's a small, noisy minority who don't want this. So I think big picture, the Premier's doing good things and he has huge community support.
In regards to the weapons and how people access them, when stats have recently been released last week after the Bondi Terror attack, I think a majority of Australians were very concerned about how many people own firearms. For example, we know this alleged gunman that was killed had 6 legally registered firearms. And the majority of Australians are saying, why would anyone who lives in especially major urban areas need access to that many guns?
Yeah, they don't. That's absolutely clear. No one needs 6 firearms other than perhaps professional shooters who are engaged in pest animal control or, really elite sports people. No vaguely normal person needs that number of firearms. So what's interesting, I think, that's coming out of the data that we've put together over a number of years, also Gun Control Australia have been looking at, what's interesting is the number of people licensed to have firearms is pretty steady in Australia, but the number of guns has been increasing substantially. There's actually now more guns in Australia than ever before. There's over 4 million guns compared to 3 million before Port Arthur and less than 2.5 million after the John Howard buybacks. So we're seeing fewer or the same number of people owning more guns. So now there's an average per license, there's an average of 4.5 guns owned. So your average gun licensee has between 4 and 5 guns. And so I think it's that trend of small numbers of people becoming more and more heavily armed that the caps on the number of firearms that could be owned that the New South Wales Premier is pushing for and that Western Australia has already legislated, that's what that's really trying to target.
Rod, in regards to the increase in weapons, why are we seeing an increased number in firearms? Are they linked to criminal gangs? What's behind the increase?
Yeah, look, I don't think anyone really knows exactly what is behind the increase. There's certainly been no substantial uptick in the number of people participating in hunting or target shooting sports. So I think there's a lot of concern that there's been manipulation of the gun regulations and in particular the requirement that you have to have what's called a legitimate reason. And we've seen that simply being a member of the Sporting Shooters Association of Australia is used sometimes as being your genuine reason. In fact, the Queensland branch advertises that just being a member of their club, which you can do, in their words, from the comfort of your living room, constitutes a genuine reason. So I think the reason for that has been abuse or a loophole around genuine reasons for owning a firearm. And again, it's good to see proposals to tighten that up.
Rob, we know there's been a number of drive-by shootings in many areas right across the country. One would presume that's involved with criminal activity. And also, recent stats show around 2,000 guns are stolen in Australia every year. That's about 1 every 4 hours. So a critic may say this is fantastic. The New South Wales government, instills or enables tougher gun reform, but it's actually not going to stop the number of illegal weapons that criminals or offenders can use. What would you say to that?
Oh, no, it absolutely does reduce the number of guns going into the underworld. So what we see is the higher gun ownership rates are, the higher the rates of gun theft are. So Tasmania has the highest per capita rate of gun ownership in the country, and Tasmania also has the highest rate of gun theft. And so it's fairly simple stuff. The more guns that are in the community, the more guns that get stolen and end up in the hands of criminals. So the big picture is really simple. Fewer guns leads to a safer community. And all of the proposals that we're seeing this week ultimately result in fewer guns in the community, and that's a good thing.
For people in regional areas, if they are farmers or landowners that responsibly own guns, they use them correctly, they store them correctly, a critic may say again, why are they being penalised for the illegal activity and the irresponsibility of people in some urban areas? Do you think there should be different rules for different areas?
Let's reframe this. What is really clear from the National Firearms Agreement is, and this is almost a verbatim quote, owning a firearm in Australia is a privilege, not a right. So no one's being punished. Gun owners in Australia are privileged. They are not being punished. In terms of people living in regional areas, landholders who have pest animal problems, they're going to be largely unaffected by anything I've seen. So in Western Australia, for example, farmers who need to control pest animals are still allowed to own up to 10 guns. So there are already carve-outs for landholders and professional shooters who are engaged in feral animal management. We've seen probably the strongest advocates for feral animal management in Australia is a group known as the Invasive Species Council. They've been out very clearly saying that nothing in the proposed reforms this week will affect feral animal management. So, big picture, no, guns are a privilege in Australia. Where they do have legitimate use, we have good laws around them, and no one is being punished. What we are trying to do is keep the community safe.
In regards to that, Rod, often we have to see horrific incidents like we did on the weekend for then to say, oh, hang on a minute, there was a massive loophole in the legislation. How were these alleged gunmen able to get access to these weapons and they were legally registered? Why do you think we have to see horrific circumstances and terror attacks happen before we all realise the legislation was wrong?
Yeah, look, I think governments and, look, to some extent the community have been complacent on this for quite a long time. I think as a community, we look back and think gun control in Australia, we sorted that in the late 1990s. John Howard sorted that. Haven't we done well? Aren't we world leaders? Yeah, we were. Yes, we are. But the numbers don't lie. Gun numbers in Australia have been increasing for a long time. We've got more guns in Australia now than ever before. And we've been slow to turn our attention back to gun law reform. It hasn't been the hot topic that it always is after a tragedy like this. So I think it's a sense of complacency responding to that policy success. We do know what to do. We do know how to improve community safety by getting guns out of the community, by getting the most dangerous guns out of the community. So, I think it's sad, but there's been a long sense of complacency around what's happening with guns in Australia.
I'm glad you made that point there, Rod. The majority of Australians before what unfolded on the weekend would have said John Howard cracked down after Port Arthur and, we have guns under control in Australia. What happened between John Howard's crackdown on gun law reform and now? Why have we seen an increase in ownership of guns? Why have we seen an increase in the number of guns and also this complacency? What happened?
Yeah, I think in terms of the complacency, governments, for better or for worse, can only focus on so many things at once. And the National Firearms Agreement that came in, it was historic and everyone agreed to it in 1997. It was re-agreed to in 2017, but it actually never came in full. This has been discussed a bit this week. We still don't have a national firearms registry, a centralised place that law enforcement and the public can go to get standardised, informative and appropriate data. Still doesn't exist nearly 30 years later. So, I think we just turned away from it. We as a community and governments in particular, of no particular stripe though, we've had numerous governments of all colours, persuasions and crossbench involvement. I think we've just taken our eye off the ball. And I think it's as simple as that.
We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much, Rod.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me.
That was Rod Campbell from the Australia Institute. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.